The Seville sun was shining brightly that spring morning when my daughter-in-law, Consuelo, arrived at our house in the Santa Cruz neighborhood. I, Lucia, was finishing dressing my little Oscar, who was barely 6 months old. The doorbell rang and Diego, my husband, went to open the door. "Good morning, my love," Consuelo exclaimed with that honeyed voice that she always used with her son. "Where is my precious little grandson?" I sighed deeply, mentally preparing myself for what was to come. Consuelo had always been a dominant woman, and since Oscar's birth, her visits had become more frequent and exhausting. "We're in the bedroom, Consuelo," I responded, trying to sound as friendly as possible. I heard his footsteps approaching and within seconds, he appeared at the door with a radiant smile. "There's my little angel," he said, quickly approaching the crib where Oscar was playing with his favorite rattle. "Good morning, Consuelo," I greeted her, forcing a smile. "What brings you here so early?" "Oh, dear," he responded without taking his eyes off Oscar. "I thought I could take my grandson for a walk in the Maria Luisa Park. It's a beautiful day and the fresh air will do him great." I was paralyzed for a moment. I had never left Oscar alone with Consuelo before, and the idea gave me a strange feeling of unease. However, I knew that refusing would only cause problems with Diego. "I don't know, Consuelo," I said doubtfully. "Oscar is still very small and—" "Please, Lucia," she interrupted, turning to look at me with pleading eyes. "I'm his grandmother, don't you trust me? Besides, I have years of experience raising children. Diego turned out perfectly, right?" At that moment, Diego entered the room. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking at us alternately. "Your mother wants to take Oscar for a walk," I explained, seeking support in her eyes. Diego smiled. "I think it's a great idea. Mom, why don't you take him to the Plaza de España too? Oscar will love to see the pigeons." I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. How could Diego agree so easily? But I started to protest, but Consuelo was already lifting Oscar from the crib. "Don't worry, dear," he said in a tone that was meant to be reassuring. "I'll take care of him as if he were my own son. We'll be back before lunch." I looked at Diego for help, but he just shrugged. "Come on, Lucia, it will do Oscar good to spend time with his grandmother," he said, giving me a kiss on the cheek before leaving the room. With a heavy heart, I watched as Consuelo prepared Oscar for the walk. I put his hat on him to protect him from the sun and gave him a kiss on the forehead. "Be good, my love," I whispered, already feeling his absence. I watched from the window as Consuelo walked away with Oscar in her stroller, getting lost among the narrow streets of the neighborhood. The next few hours were torture. I couldn't concentrate on anything, constantly looking at the clock and wincing at every noise. Finally, around 2 in the afternoon, I heard the doorbell ring. I ran to open the door and there they were, Consuelo smiling and Oscar fast asleep in his stroller. "We're back," Consuelo announced happily. "We've had a wonderful day, haven't we, my darling?" he said, gently caressing Oscar's cheek. I took Oscar in my arms, hugging him tightly. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Hanging around my son's neck was a small gold medal that I didn't recognize. "Consuelo," I said, trying to stay calm, "what is this?" She looked at the medal and smiled. "Oh, that. It's just a small souvenir from our walk. We passed by the Church of the Savior and Father Alejandro gave it to us. It's a medal of the Virgin of the Kings, to protect our little angel." Something in his tone of voice, in the way he avoided my direct gaze, made me suspect that there was more to this story than what he was telling me. But before he could investigate further, Consuelo hurriedly said goodbye, claiming that she had commitments. As I watched her walk away, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. There was something about Consuelo's behavior that didn't add up, a nervous attitude that I had never noticed in her before. And that medal, why did he feel like it hid a deeper secret? That night, while I put Oscar to bed, I couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. Something told me that this day would mark a before and after in my relationship with Consuelo, and that the secrets that were beginning to emerge would soon come to light, changing our lives forever. The days went by and I couldn't get Oscar's strange walk with his grandmother out of my mind. Every time I saw the medal on my son's neck, a shiver ran down my spine. I tried to convince myself that I was exaggerating, but my gut told me that something wasn't right. One sunny morning, I decided to go to the Triana market. I needed to distract myself and, in the process, buy fresh ingredients for dinner. The bustle of the market always cheered me up, with its colorful stalls and the aroma of spices wafting through the air. While I was picking some ripe tomatoes, I heard a familiar voice. Lucia. What a surprise to find you here. I turned to see Sophia, my childhood friend, approaching with a smile. Sophia. How nice to see you, I responded, hugging her. How are you? Good, good. And you? How is little Oscar? We began chatting animatedly, catching up on our lives. Sophia was telling me about her new job when, suddenly, her expression changed. By the way, Lucia, he said, lowering his voice, I wanted to ask you something. The other day I saw your mother-in-law, Consuelo, in the Church of the Savior. I was with Father Alejandro and, well, I thought I saw Oscar with them. I felt like the ground was moving under my feet. What do you mean? I asked, trying to stay calm. Sophia looked uncomfortable. Well, it seemed like a ceremony. Father Alejandro was blessing Oscar and... Lucia, did you allow Consuelo to baptize Oscar? The world stopped around me. The voices of the market became a distant hum. That. I managed to articulate, feeling anger and disbelief take over me. I'm sorry, I thought you knew, Sophia said, worried. Maybe I was wrong, maybe it wasn't a baptism. But I wasn't listening to her anymore. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. The walk, the medal, Consuelo's nervous behavior. Everything took on a new and horrible meaning. I have to go, I muttered, setting the shopping basket on the floor. I stormed out of the market, ignoring Sophia's screams behind me. I walked aimlessly through the streets of Triana, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. How had Consuelo dared to do something like that? How could he betray my trust like that? I arrived at the Triana bridge and stopped, looking at the Guadalquivir. The waters of the river flowed calmly, oblivious to the storm that was raging inside me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but it was useless. Fury grew in my chest like an uncontrollable beast. I took out my phone and dialed Consuelo's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. When I was about to hang up, I heard his voice. Say. Consuelo, I said, with a calmness I didn't feel, I need you to come home. Now. Lucia, dear, is something wrong? You know exactly what's going on, I responded, struggling to maintain control. I'll wait for you in an hour. I hung up without waiting for a response and headed home. Along the way, my mind kept spinning. How would he face Consuelo? What would you say to Diego? How could he trust her again after this? When I got home, I found Diego playing with Oscar in the living room. Honey, are you okay? He asked, seeing my expression. You seem upset. Your mother is on her way, I replied dryly. We need to talk. The next hour was torture. Diego tried to find out from me what was happening, but I refused to speak until Consuelo arrived. Finally, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and there she was, with her usual smile. But this time, that smile only served to increase my anger. Come in, I said coldly. Consuelo entered, happily greeting Diego and approaching Oscar to give him a kiss. I got in the way. Sit down, I ordered. We need to talk. Diego looked at us confused. What's going on? I took a deep breath and looked directly at Consuelo. Do you want to tell him or should I tell him? Consuelo paled. Lucia, I don't know what you're talking about. No. I interrupted, my voice shaking with rage. Don't you know anything about a certain baptism in the Church of the Savior? The silence that followed was deafening. Diego looked at us alternately, confused and worried. Mom, he finally said, what is Lucia talking about? Consuelo looked down, her facade crumbling. I only wanted the best for Oscar, he murmured. The best? I screamed, finally losing control. Do you think it's best to betray our trust? Baptize our child behind our backs? Diego jumped up. What? Mom, is that true? Consuelo began to cry. I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure Oscar was protected. You guys weren't going to baptize him and It wasn't your decision, I interrupted. He's our son, Consuelo. Ours. The discussion continued for hours. Consuelo tried to justify herself. Diego was torn between disbelief and disappointment, and I just felt that something had been broken forever. When Consuelo finally left, the house fell into a heavy silence. Diego tried to hug me, but I moved away. I need to be alone, I muttered, heading to Oscar's room. There, watching my son sleep peacefully, oblivious to all the drama, I made a decision. This wouldn't stay like this. Consuelo had crossed a line and I would make sure she paid for it. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to make him regret his betrayal. With that determination burning in my chest, I gently kissed Oscar's forehead and left the room. The war had begun. The days following the revelation of the secret baptism were a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, and the desire for revenge mixed inside me, stealing my sleep and peace. Diego was trying to mediate, suggesting that we forgive Consuelo, who perhaps had acted with good intentions. But I couldn't forget so easily. One morning, while Diego had gone to work and Oscar was sleeping peacefully in his crib, I made a decision. Not only did I want to confirm my suspicions about the baptism, but I needed to know if there were any more hidden secrets. Consuelo had betrayed my trust once, who knows how many more times she would have done it. With determination, I sat down at my computer and began researching. I searched for information on listening devices, hidden cameras, and all kinds of surveillance equipment. I wanted to make sure I chose the best and most discreet. If Consuelo wants to play dirty, I muttered to myself, I'll show her how it's done. After hours of research, I found what I was looking for: small, almost imperceptible wireless microphones that I could easily hide in Consuelo's house. The idea of invading his privacy made me feel uncomfortable, but I justified it by thinking of his own betrayal. I ordered the devices and eagerly awaited their arrival. Meanwhile, he was meticulously planning how he would install them. Consuelo had the habit of inviting us to dinner every Sunday. It was my perfect opportunity. The day arrived and, with my heart racing, I prepared to execute my plan. I hid the devices in my bag and we headed to Consuelo's house. "My loves," Consuelo exclaimed as she opened the door for us, trying to hug Oscar. I pushed him away subtly, not yet ready to allow that level of closeness. "Good night, Consuelo," I said with a forced smile. Dinner passed in a tense normality. Diego was trying to maintain a light conversation, while I was looking for the right moment to execute my plan. "Excuse me, I need to go to the bathroom," I finally said, getting up from the table. Once in the hallway, I moved quickly. I placed a microphone behind a painting in the living room, another under a flower pot in the kitchen, and a third in Consuelo's room, hidden among the books on her bookshelf. With my heart in my throat, I returned to the table. Sorry for the delay, I excused myself, sitting back down. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I could barely concentrate on the conversation, thinking about the hidden devices and what they might reveal. The next few days were a torture of expectation and guilt. Every night, after Diego fell asleep, I sat in front of my computer, listening to the recordings. At first, it was just banal conversations, everyday noises, nothing relevant. But one night, almost a week later, I heard something that made my blood run cold. "Alejandro, we have to talk." Consuelo's voice sounded worried. "Lucia suspects something about the baptism." "Calm down, Consuelo," responded a male voice that I assumed was Father Alejandro's. "They can't prove anything. Besides, we did the right thing. The boy needed God's protection." "I know, but what if they find out about us? Not just the baptism, but everything else." I felt like I was short of breath. Ours? Everything else? What else was Consuelo hiding? I continued listening, night after night, accumulating information. I discovered that Consuelo and Father Alejandro had been in a relationship for years, long before I met Diego. Oscar's secret baptism had been nothing more than the tip of the iceberg. A part of me felt guilty for invading Consuelo's privacy like this, but another part, the one still burning with rage at her betrayal, rejoiced at each new discovery. One night, While listening to a particularly revealing conversation between Consuelo and Father Alejandro, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I jumped and turned to meet Diego's confused and hurt gaze. "Lucia, what are you doing?" he asked, looking at the computer screen. For a moment, I thought about lying, about hiding everything I had been doing. But she was tired of the lies and secrets. "Diego," I said, taking a deep breath, "there's something you need to know." For the next few hours, I told him everything. The listening devices, the recordings, what he had discovered about his mother and Father Alejandro. I watched as his face went from disbelief to pain, and finally to anger. "I can't believe it," he murmured, running his hands through his hair. "My mother, how could she?" "I'm sorry, Diego," I said, taking his hand. "I know I shouldn't have done it this way, but—" "No," he interrupted me, squeezing my hand. "You did well to find out. I need time to process everything." The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult decisions. Diego was devastated, torn between love for his mother and disappointment at her actions. I, for my part, felt a mixture of triumph and guilt. "What are we going to do now?" Diego asked one night, as we watched Oscar sleep. I looked at him, seeing the conflict in his eyes. "I think," I said slowly, "that it is time for Consuelo to face the consequences of her actions." Diego nodded, resigned. "You're right. But how?" An idea began to form in my mind. An idea that could expose everything, that could change our lives forever. "I have a plan," I said, feeling a mix of determination and fear. "But I need you to trust me." Diego stared at me for a moment, then nodded. "I trust you, Lucia. Let's do it." That night, as we planned how to confront Consuelo and expose her secrets, I felt like we were on the edge of a precipice. What would come next would change our lives forever, but there was no turning back. It was time for the truth to come out, no matter the consequences. The next few days were a roller coaster of emotions. Diego and I took turns listening to the recordings, discovering more and more secrets hidden in Consuelo's life. Each revelation was like a dagger that stabbed into our hearts, especially Diego's. One afternoon, while Oscar was taking his nap, we sat in the living room to listen to the latest batch of recordings. The device in Consuelo's room had captured a telephone conversation that took our breath away. "Alejandro, my love," Consuelo's voice sounded sweet and loving, so different from how we knew her. "Shall we meet tonight at the usual place?" "Of course, my dear," Father Alexander's voice responded. "But be careful. We don't want anyone to get suspicious." "Don't worry," Consuelo laughed. "Diego and Lucia have no idea. They still believe that the baptism was my only prank." I looked at Diego, who had closed his eyes and clenched his fists tightly. "I can't believe it," he murmured. "My mother and Father Alejandro, how long has this lasted?" We kept listening, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Through several conversations, we discovered that the relationship between Consuelo and Father Alejandro had been going on for more than 20 years. They had kept their affair a secret all this time, deceiving not only the family, but the entire community of the Church of the Savior. "Diego," I said softly, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Very sorry." He shook his head, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and determination. "It's not your fault, Lucia. It's her who's been lying to us all this time." We continue listening, discovering more details of their clandestine relationship. Apparently, they met regularly in a small apartment in the Triana neighborhood, away from prying eyes. They talked about their plans for the future, how one day they could be together openly. "Do you think we'll ever tell Diego the truth?" Father Alejandro asked in one of the recordings. Consuelo sighed. "I don't know, Alejandro. I'm afraid of his reaction. Diego has always been very traditional, very attached to the image of a perfect family that we have projected. I don't know if he could understand it." I looked at Diego, who was listening with his eyes closed and an expression of deep pain on his face. It hurt me to see him like this, but I knew we needed to hear everything to get the full picture. "And then there's Lucia," Consuelo continued. "I've never liked that girl. Always questioning, always challenging my decisions. If she finds out about us, I'm sure she'll use it against me. I felt a pang of anger when I heard those words. How dare she talk about me like that, when she was the one who had been deceiving us all this time? Calm down, my love, Father Alejandro responded. No one has to know. We've kept this a secret for so long, we can keep doing it. The recording ended, leaving us in a heavy silence. Diego got up and walked to the window, looking without really seeing outside. My whole life, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. My whole life has been a lie. I got up and approached him, hugging him from behind. Not everything, Diego. Your love for Oscar, our marriage, that's real. She turned and looked at me, her eyes filled with unshed tears. I know, Lucia. And it's the only thing keeping me going right now. We stayed like that, holding each other, for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, Diego pulled away and looked at me with determination. We have to confront her, he said. We cannot continue living with this lie. I nodded, completely agreeing. But we need solid evidence. Not just the recordings, but something he can't deny. We spent the next few days gathering all the evidence we could. In addition to the recordings, I managed to obtain photographs of Consuelo and Father Alejandro together, entering and leaving the apartment in Triana. I even got copies of receipts and invoices that proved that Consuelo had been paying for that apartment for years. One night, while we were reviewing all the material we had collected, Diego found something that took our breath away. Lucia, look at this, he said, showing me a document. It was a letter, written more than 30 years ago. In it, Father Alejandro confessed his love to Consuelo and asked her to leave her husband, Diego's father, to be together. This means. Diego couldn't finish the sentence. That their relationship started even before you were born, I completed, feeling a knot in my stomach. Diego collapsed onto the couch, the weight of this new revelation clearly overwhelming. Do you think he could be? He didn't need to finish the question for me to understand. The possibility that Father Alejandro could be Diego's real father was an idea that neither of them dared say out loud. We don't know for sure, I said, trying to stay calm. And we can't jump to conclusions. But it's definitely something we need to clarify. Diego nodded, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. You're right. We need answers, and we need them now. It was in that moment, watching my husband struggle with the possibility that his entire life had been built on a lie, that I made a decision. Diego, I said, taking his hands in mine. I think it's time to put an end to all this. Let's confront your mother, but not just her. I think we should organize a meeting with the whole family. He looked at me, surprised. You mean? I nodded. Yes. A big family lunch. We will invite everyone, your mother, your uncles, cousins, even Father Alejandro. And there, in front of everyone, we will expose the truth. Diego was silent for a moment, considering the idea. Finally, a small smile, the first he had seen in days, appeared on his face. Let's do it, he said. It's time for the truth to come out. That night, as we planned the details of our big reveal, I felt a mix of anticipation and dread. I knew that what we were about to do would change our lives forever. But I also knew it was necessary. The truth, no matter how painful, was always better than living a lie. With that conviction, we set about setting the stage for the day when all the family's secrets would come to light. The following days were a whirlwind of preparations and nerves. Diego and I decided to organize the family lunch at the San Fernando restaurant, an elegant and discreet place in the heart of Seville. We wanted a neutral environment, far from Consuelo's house or ours, where everyone would feel comfortable, at least at first. While Diego was in charge of making reservations and coordinating with the restaurant, I dedicated myself to collecting and organizing all the evidence we had accumulated. Recordings, photographs, documents, all carefully organized in a folder that I kept in my bag as if it were a treasure. The morning of the big day came sooner than we expected. I woke up early, my stomach in knots with nerves and anticipation. Diego was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into space. Are you sure you want to do this? I asked him softly, sitting next to him. He looked at me, his eyes full of determination. More than ever. It's time for the truth to come out. We prepared in silence, each one immersed in his own thoughts. I dressed Oscar in his best clothes, as if that could somehow protect him from the storm that was about to break loose. We arrived at the restaurant an hour earlier than agreed. The maître d' greeted us with a friendly smile, oblivious to the drama that was about to unfold in his establishment. "This way, please," he guided us to a private room at the back of the restaurant. "As requested, we have prepared the table for 12 people." Diego nodded, thanking the man. Once alone, we began to set the stage. I discreetly placed my phone in a strategic location, ready to record. Diego arranged the chairs so that Consuelo and Father Alejandro were facing us. Little by little, the guests began to arrive. First, Diego's uncles, then his cousins. Everyone greeted us with joy, commenting on how beautiful Oscar looked and what a good idea it had been to get the family together. Consuelo arrived on time, as always. He entered the room with a radiant smile, kissing everyone on the cheek. When he reached me, I noticed a slight waver in his smile. "Lucia, dear," he said, with that honeyed voice that he hated so much. "What a wonderful idea you've had. It's been a while since the family got together like this." I forced a smile. "Thank you, Consuelo. I thought it was a good opportunity to catch up." The last to arrive was Father Alejandro. He entered with his usual solemn air, greeting everyone with blessings and kind smiles. I noticed how his gaze briefly crossed Consuelo's, a gesture imperceptible to anyone who didn't know what we knew. Once everyone was seated, the waiter began to serve the starters. The conversation flowed animatedly around the table, everyone oblivious to the tension that Diego and I felt. It was during the main course that I decided it was time. I looked at Diego, who nodded imperceptibly. I took a deep breath and stood up, gently tapping my glass with a piece of cutlery to get everyone's attention. "Family," I began, feeling all eyes on me. "I want to thank you all for coming today. As you know, Diego and I have brought you together because we have something important to share with you." I watched as Consuelo tensed slightly in her chair, her smile wavering for a moment. "In recent weeks," I continued, "we have discovered some disturbing things. Things that affect our entire family and that we believe everyone has a right to know." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the confusion and curiosity in the air. "Consuelo," I said, looking directly at her. "Is there anything you want to share with the family? Something about Father Alejandro, perhaps?" I watched as the color drained from Consuelo's face. Father Alejandro, for his part, remained completely still, like a statue. I don't know what you're talking about, Lucia," Consuelo stammered, trying to maintain her composure. That's when Diego stood up next to me. "Mom," he said, his voice firm but thick with emotion. "We know everything. About your relationship with Father Alejandro, about Oscar's secret baptism, about the apartment in Triana. Everything." Murmurs of surprise and shock filled the room. I watched as Diego's uncles exchanged looks of disbelief, while his cousins looked completely stunned. That's ridiculous," Consuelo tried to defend herself. "Diego, my son, how can you believe such lies?" It was at that moment that I took the folder out of my bag. "They are not lies, Consuelo," I said, beginning to distribute copies of the evidence among those present. "We have evidence. Recordings, photographs, documents." Chaos broke out in the room. Everyone spoke at the same time, demanding explanations, expressing their shock and indignation. Consuelo tried to defend herself, denying everything, while Father Alejandro remained in a stony silence. "How could you?" one of Diego's uncles shouted. "Cheating on your husband, your family, the entire community. And you, Father," exclaimed one of the cousins, addressing the priest. "He's supposed to be a man of God." In the midst of the chaos, I watched as Consuelo finally broke down. Tears began to run down her cheeks as she looked at Diego with a mixture of shame and pleading. "My son," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Everything I did out of love." Diego looked at her, his face a mask of pain and disappointment. "Love? You call living a lie all my life love? Cheating on Dad, on me, on the whole family?" Father Alejandro finally broke his silence. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I understand your anger, your disappointment. But you must understand. Consuelo and I, our love. Silence, roared Diego, slamming his fist on the table. You have no right to talk about love. Not after what they've done. I approached Diego, putting a hand on his shoulder to calm him. Then, I addressed the entire family. I know this is a shock to everyone, I said. But we believed they deserved to know the truth. We couldn't continue living a lie. The family lunch we had planned became an emotional battleground. Accusations, cries of indignation. Everything we had kept hidden for so long came to light in the most explosive way possible. As I watched the chaos around us, I felt a mix of relief and fear. The truth had finally come out, but at what cost? How would this affect our family in the future? With Oscar asleep in my arms, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him, I realized this was just the beginning. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. The chaos that had broken out at the San Fernando restaurant seemed to have no end. Voices were raised, accusations were flying from one side to the other, and in the midst of it all, Consuelo and Father Alejandro remained seated, like two prisoners awaiting their sentence. I decided it was time to take control of the situation. I stood up, holding Oscar in my arms, and in a firm voice said, "Please, everyone, calm down. I know this is hard to take, but yelling won't get us anywhere." Little by little, tempers calmed down. Diego was standing next to me, his face a mask of pain and determination. "Now," I continued, "I think it's time for us to listen to what Consuelo and Father Alejandro have to say. After all, we owe them at least that." Consuelo looked up, his eyes reddened by crying. I don't know where to start," he said in a trembling voice. "Maybe at the beginning," Diego suggested, his cold voice like ice. "When did all this start?" Father Alejandro took the hand of Consuelo, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by anyone at the table. "It was a long time ago," he began. "Before you were born, Diego." A collective gasoline toward the table. Diego paled visibly. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, although due to his tone, it was evident that he feared the answer. Consuelo sobbed. "Diego, my son. Your father and I. We had problems. He was traveling a lot, we were distanced. And then I met Alejandro." "No," Diego interrupted, his voice just a whisper. "Don't say it." But Consuelo continued, the words coming out of her as an unstoppable torrent. "We fell in love. It was something we couldn't control. And then I discovered that I was pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were fixed in Diego, who seemed to have become stone. Are you saying that?" Diego could not finish the phrase. Father Alejandro stood up, his face a mixture of shame and determination. "Diego, I am your biological father." The chaos unleashed again. Diego's uncles shouted indignantly, his cousins murmured with each other, and Diego simply collapsed in his chair, with his lost look. I approached him, still holding Oscar, who miraculously followed asleep in the middle of all the uproar. "Diego," I whispered, "I'm here with you." He looked at me, his eyes full of contained tears. "All my life," he murmured, "my whole life has been a lie." It was then that I decided that it was time to present the rest of the evidence. I took my phone and reproduced some of the most revealing recordings. Consuelo's voice filled the room. "Alejandro, my love, do you think that one day we can tell Diego the truth?" "I don't know, comfort. I fear I can't forgive us." The recordings continued, revealing years of secret encounters, of lies and deceptions. With each new revelation, I saw how the image of the perfect family that Consuelo had built was crumbled as a castle of cards. When the recordings ended, the silence that followed was heavy, full of emotions contained. "How could you?" he finally asked one of Diego's uncles, addressing Consuelo. "How could you lie to your own son throughout his life?" Consuelo, who seemed to have aged 10 years, responded in a broken voice, "I did it to protect it. To give him a stable family, a home." "A lie," Diego interrupted, his voice full of bitterness. "You gave me a lie, Mom. A life based on deception." Father Alejandro tried to intervene. Diego, son. Don't call me like that. Diego exploded. You are not my father. My father was the man who raised me, who loved me, who was there for me. You are nothing for me. I saw how those words hit Father Alejandro as a physical punch. He collapsed in his chair, the weight of his actions finally falling on him. That was when I decided it was time to end all this. I think, I said, raising my voice to make me heard above the general murmur, that we all need time to process this. It has been a shocking revelation for everyone. The relatives nodded, starting to get up from their chairs. Some launched contempt looks towards Consuelo and Father Alejandro, others simply seemed stunned. While people began to leave, I approached Consuelo. I hope you understand, I said in a low voice, that things can't continue as before. Not after this. She nodded, tears running freely down her cheeks. I know, he whispered. I have lost everything, right? I didn't answer. There was no need. The truth was there, clear as the day, in the faces shocked of the family, in Diego's lost look, in the sepulchral silence that had fallen over Father Alejandro. While we left the restaurant, with Diego walking like an automaton by my side and Oscar finally waking up in my arms, I felt the weight of what we had done. We had exposed the truth, yes, but at a terrible cost. The family that we once met no longer existed. Instead, there was a group of people injured, confused, trying to find meaning in a world that had suddenly put on top legs. While we got into the car, I looked at Diego. Are you okay? I asked, knowing it was a silly question at that time. He looked at me, his eyes a mixture of pain and determination. No, he replied honestly. But I will be. We have to be, for Oscar. I nodded, understanding what I wanted to say. Despite all the pain and confusion, we had to move on. For our son, for ourselves. While we were driving back home, leaving behind the restaurant and chaos we had unleashed, I realized that this was just the beginning. The truth had come to light, yes, but the consequences of that truth were just beginning to deploy. And we, for good or for evil, we would have to face them together. The days that followed the revelation at the San Fernando restaurant were a whirlwind of emotions and changes. The family that had once been united was now fragmented, divided by long-stored secrets and finally exposed lies. Consuelo, my mother-in-law, had become an outcast within her own family. Nobody wanted to talk to her, and the few who did it was only to express their disappointment and disgust. Father Alejandro, meanwhile, had completely disappeared. There was a rumor that the bishop had moved him to a small parish somewhere remote from Extremadura. Diego, my husband, looked like a lost man. He spent hours sitting in silence, looking out the window, as if looking for answers on the horizon of Seville. I tried to be there for him, but sometimes I felt that an abyss had opened among us. One morning, while preparing breakfast, Diego entered the kitchen with a determined expression on his face. Lucia, he said, his firm voice for the first time in days, I think we should move. I looked surprised. Move ourselves? Where? I don't know, he replied, passing a hand through his hair. Far from here. Far from Seville, from memories, of everything. He understood his desire to escape, to start over. But I also knew that fleeing was not the solution. Diego, I said gently, approaching him, I know you are suffering. But we can't simply run away. We have a life here, friends, jobs. A life based on lies. He interrupted, his voice full of bitterness. No, I replied firmly. A life we have built together. A life with Oscar. That's real, Diego. That is not a lie. I saw how his eyes softened by mentioning our son. Oscar, oblivious to the entire drama, was still a ray of light in our lives. You're right, Diego finally said, dropping into a chair. But I can't bear the idea of continuing here, to cross with she on the street. I understood perfectly what he meant. Consuelo, despite everything, continued to live in his home in the center of Seville. The possibility of meeting her was constant, a source of anxiety for all of us. It was then that an idea began to form in my mind. Maybe, I said slowly, let's not have to leave. Diego looked at me confused. What do you mean? Maybe, I continued, be it Comfort who should leave. We spend the following days. We contacted a lawyer, we collect all the evidence we had, and finally, we convened a family reunion. The meeting took place in our house. All family members were there, except Consuelo. The air tension was palpable. "Thank you all for coming," Diego began, his voice trembling slightly. "I know that the last weeks have been difficult for everyone. But we have made a decision." I then explained our plan. Using the evidence we had about the affair of Consuelo and Father Alejandro, as well as the lie about Diego's fatherhood, we intended to press Consuelo to leave Seville. "We do not want to destroy it," I clarified, seeing the expressions of surprise in the faces of the family. "We just want him to leave. Give us the opportunity to heal, to rebuild our lives without their constant shadow." There was a moment of silence, and then, little by little, everyone began to nod. "It makes sense," said one of Diego's uncles. "After what he did, it's the minimum he can do." With the support of the family, we put our plan in progress. We sent Consuelo an ultimatum: either voluntarily went from Seville, or we would make public all the evidence we had. The answer came 2 days later. Consuelo agreed to leave, with the condition that we allowed him to say goodbye to Oscar. It was a difficult decision, but we finally agreed. The farewell took place in a park, neutral land. Consuelo arrived with reddened eyes, he had clearly been crying. "Thank you for allowing me," he said, his voice just a whisper. Diego nodded, unable to look her in the eye. I held Oscar, who looked at his grandmother with curiosity. Consuelo approached and gently stroked Oscar's cheek. "My little angel," he murmured. "I hope you can forgive your grandmother one day. I love you more than you can imagine." Then he turned to us. "I know I don't deserve his forgiveness," he said, tears running freely down his cheeks. "But I want you to know what I'm sorry. I feel all the damage I have caused." Diego finally looked at her. "Maybe one day," he said, his voice full of emotion. "But not today. Not now." Consuelo nodded, understanding. With a last look at Oscar, he turned around and moved away. We saw her walk until she disappeared between the crowd, a lonely figure carrying the weight of her actions. The following days were an activity whirlwind. We learned that Consuelo had moved to a small town in Extremadura, far from the accusing looks and whispers of civilian society. Little by little, life began to resume its course. The absence of Comfort, although painful in many ways, brought with it a feeling of relief, as if a weight had been raised from our shoulders. One afternoon, while we walked through Maria Luisa's park with Oscar, Diego suddenly stopped. "No," he said, looking at our son who played happily in his stroller. "I think we are going to be well." I looked at him, surprised by the note of optimism in his voice. "Do you really believe it?" He nodded, a little smile forming on his lips. "Yes. It will not be easy, and it will take time. But we have something that Comfort never had." "That?" I asked. "The truth," he replied simply. "And we have each other. And Oscar." At that time, while I saw my husband play with our son, I felt that a wave of hope invaded me. Yes, we had gone through a storm, but we had survived. And now, with the truth of our side and the love that united us, we were ready to face what would come. The family had fractured, it is true. But of those fractures, we were building something new, something stronger. Based on honesty, forgiveness, unconditional love. While we walked back home, with the sun of Seville putting on the horizon, I knew that this was not the end of our history. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter full of challenges, without a doubt, but also full of possibilities. And together, as a family, we were ready to write it.